What's up, fellow gamers? Phreak here. I am the design lead of Summoner's Rift Team's live pod, here to talk about patch 13.23. I might be wearing a similar jacket to last video I did. This is actually a different jacket. I am a two-time Riot Rumble winner. This is the other one. Either way, let's talk about 13.23. This and the next patch, 0.24, are going to generally be smaller patches overall. I mentioned this in the patch preview video, but as our shared QA and engineering resources from Summoner's Rift Team are shifted towards seasonal, we have fewer resources to ensure the quality of our design work. So we're generally going lower scope, and we're also just doing stuff to prepare for the next year. So this is going to be a fairly light patch, and so will the next one, and then we'll see when 14.1, which is huge. PBE updated today at time of recording anyway with the seasonal update, so a bunch of really cool stuff there. This video is not about that, so either way, couple of balance updates to come in for the end of the season. Basically, it's kind of all we're doing here on live pod, is just some sort of smaller scope balance updates for the end of the year. All right, so patch 13.23 is basically just low scope balance changes. There's one cool system change that I'm excited for. Otherwise, nothing too fancy here. So first off, there are switches to Azir. This actually did not come from us. This came from the modes team. This does two things here. Basically, it's saying, hey, Azir now applies on hit effects to the primary target of his W auto attack. This is the kind of thing that we have special cased a lot of throughout time. I think he is special cased to work with Lethal Tempo and Hail of Blades, despite W not really being an auto attack. It's an obvious point of confusion for Azir players. Wait, what do you mean my photos don't trigger my on attack effects? And so I think a really good choice by the modes team to say, hey, look, we can open up a lot more Azir build variety by giving his primary W target on hit effects. And I was the Summoner's Rift Team consult on this project. My suggestion was to add a bespoke ratio so that we can tune this if needed. But essentially, this change increases the understandability, I guess, of the champion, right? It feels like he should apply on hit on attack effect, and so he is going to. I want to be clear, it's on hit effects. I don't know if there's like some special on attack stuff that would otherwise trigger but don't. But keep in mind things like Runaan's Hurricane and Kraken Slayer. Basically, yeah. So essentially all the normal stuff should work. He should trigger Energize. He should trigger Sheen effects. All this kind of stuff. Anyway. My contribution to this entire project was to change fewer levers and to add a numbers tuning lever so that we can tweak this as needed, because some things might be OP and we might want that lever, but otherwise, whatever. The design intent, all the stuff came from the designer on modes team. He tweeted about it last week, whatever. Anyway, this will probably actually make Nashor's Tooth mandatory on Azir. This hasn't been true in the past. It hasn't been true with the 13.4 update. It's not true today. It will probably be true tomorrow. I don't think Azir players seem to mind. They all want to build it anyway for the most part, as I paint with a broad brush. I'm part of that one. Anyway, let's move on and say that, yes, there are some compensation nerfs for the fact that Nashor's Tooth now applies a unique passive on Azir W. Okay, let's talk about the math and what that means. So if you never buy Nashor's Tooth, you are simply dealing less damage with W, and this is obviously pretty meaningful. Keep in mind, most of Azir's damage comes from his W, and so the fact that it's going to do less damage, again, a rule of thumb I urge you to keep in the back of your head, is if your champion's primary goal is damage, 2% less damage is about 1% lower win rate. There's obviously bounds where this is no longer true, but a way to keep this in mind is that theoretically, if this was the only nerf, we would be somewhere in the world of Azir losing 2-ish% win rate if we assume that half of all of Azir's damage is W. Maybe it's more than half. I haven't really looked, to be honest. It probably is more than half, to be clear, but whatever. Let's just assume it's half of all his damage, which means every 4% damage drop here is 1% win rate, in which case, yeah, it's 1 to 2%, it's like about 2% win rate of the champion. Maybe it'd be 3 if you want to say it's, 3/4 of his damage. Whatever, we're in the ballpark, right? That would be the magnitude of just this nerf by itself. Keep in mind, the nerf is to the rank up value by 0 to 8, as well as the per champion level value by 0 to 15, and then an AP ratio down by 5% as well. And to be clear, if we get these numbers wrong, and Azir with Nashor's Tooth really sucks, we can walk back any one or two of these three levers, and we can make good on Azir, right? Like, I believe that this is going to be win rate negative to Azir. However, also Nashor's project was the gameplay analysis team, and they thought this would be win rate positive, and so we'll see. right? They said they thought it would be about 0.5% positive. So hey, other people can disagree with me. That's totally fine. We'll see what the result is. Regardless, of course, we will retune Azir if needed. This is not a problem. We are happy to do it. If he's really bad for 2 weeks, I'm sorry. We think this will be fine, so that's what's going to be happening. I'm kind of overstating all this, but anyway, the rest of the math is, of course, he will build Nashor's Tooth. And so I'm just making the assumption he's going to build Nashor's Tooth at level 9. This is, to be fair, very early. He might be building it at level 12 or 13 if he's going for a Luden's first item instead, which, of course, might slow him down. Gat seems to think that he's able to go Nashor's first, and it's not going to be a big deal. Also, his 1 through 9 is a very small portion of the game and not that big of a deal. Keep in mind that something like a recurve bow immediately works for him. So if he's taking his first recall and he builds recurve bow first back, that's +7 on hit damage from like level 4 or 5, which makes up for most of this nerf pretty quickly. 7.5, I guess. So it's not super far off. Again, it is lower. Don't get me wrong. There are points where it's lower, but also as soon as you finish Nashor's Tooth, it is just simply better. Now, to be clear, this is only the column for single target damage. The pass-through damage, the AoE damage, is not accounted for. In the green here, it is basically just this, but at a smaller number, because it's just the total throughput of W in and of itself, by itself. So yes, once you have the item online, your single target damage is up 3 to 4%. Your AoE damage is down 8%. I would argue this is far more important than his AoE damage. Yes, his wave clear will be a little bit slower in some cases. His generic damage when attacking someone is going to be much nicer. Again, this might be winner positive, might be winner negative. Of course, this makes Nashor's look pretty mandatory on him. It is what it is. There might be some alternate builds with things like Lichbane, which lets you do WQ auto poke, which is not great. That's actually part of why I suggested having this lever here, was to make Lichbane less optimal, because that's definitely a real worry. We can do things like nerfing Azir's base AD to make the Sheen part of Lichbane not good. Lichbane does care about your base AD and your AP ratio. There's stuff we could do, again, as retuning. Regardless, here are the numbers, and there's a change to Azir to make Nashor's Tooth pretty obviously optimal on him at this point, which again seems to be reasonable. It's something that Azir players seem to want anyway, so whatever. Next is a change to Briar. We nerfed her. It did very, very, very little in the previous patch, and so we're trying again with a bigger swing. This is a revert from the day 1 micro patch of Briar, which gave her some usability on E and base health. I figured that those are really good band-aids for people who are learning the champion. Now that players have learned the champion, I think we should keep the E changes. I actually really, really think the E changes were great, but I think base health is less required, and so something that we are allowed to nerf. Her health growth is already quite low for a melee champion, and so I figured, well, her base health has a little bit of room to go down. I think it's allowed to do so. Obviously, she's at full health kind of all the time. She full heals through her jungle, no problem at all. So if you don't fully one-shot her, she doesn't care. But the reason I went for health is because basically she's still in a world where her lethality builds are doing better than her fighter builds. And so trying to find ways to tactically close that gap in ways that are reasonable to the champion. August wants to take a crack at closing the gap on the builds as well. We'll probably see something in like 14.1 or 14.2 or something, where we close the gap on Briar builds, would be my guess here. Or there's something that comes out of the exploration and nothing changes, who knows? Or the changes are perfect somehow, which I doubt highly, but maybe theoretically maybe just possible. Though again, very doubtful. Regardless, 20 health off Briar means something. We think it's not going to be all that much. And so the bigger change is a nerf to the missing health damage on snack attack. And the reason I went for the missing health damage on snack attack was because keep in mind that when you cast W, you only have those, 5 seconds to recast your W. Which, like, hey, this damage is going to be the same no matter what happens. But the more damage you can deal in those first 5 seconds, the more this second part, the missing health damage, is going to do. Which means if you're running Halo Blades or have a lot of upfront burst damage, that's going to multiply into this damage. Plus the fact that lethality itself is going to multiply the rather solid base damage of this spell in and of itself. So my theory is that the W execute is a lethality skewed output, whereas a fighter version of Briar doesn't care quite as much and isn't killing you with W2. She's dealing meaningful damage, but she's still playing the rest of the combat pattern out. More likely than not. That's kind of the guess here. We'll see if I'm wrong, but that's kind of the guess here. And so hoping to close the gap once again between the builds this way. Here is the math. This is just simply base health before and after. Again, if you're going to go for Stride Breaker, Black Cleaver, Gorger, and things like that, you're going to have more health overall. This nerf will be lesser, but again, a certain, nerf to her overall base health. And then here is the extrapolated total damage of the W. well, the extrapolated execute damage of the W. It is more of a nerf late than early. Keep in mind that it's a flat 1% nerf and then a 1% per 100 AD ratio nerf, so obviously the flat 1% is going to happen no matter what, and then this can only scale up over time. This does hurt her late game more than her early game. It kind of can't not. There's not a way around that, really. But whatever, I think it's fine no matter what. Regardless, trying to lower the gold scaling so that if you do get ahead really quickly and you get like a fast like first recall serrated Dirk, it's going to spike less because lower AD ratio, of course. That's kind of the hope here, right? Make Briar a little bit less snowbally, make her a little bit less assassin, and we'll see if that ends up being the case here. She can rely on more than just executing to keep herself going, and again, a 10 to 18-ish% less damage than execute, which will certainly do something. Of course, the other half of W still matters, right? This is still unchanged. That's Briar. Draven, a small QoL change. I made this change. This was basically reading Reddit and seeing that it felt weird that Draven R should fail while he's dead. This was not spaghetti code. This was whatever designer put in this implementation, which was years and years and years ago. The missile is specifically said that like, when Draven is dead, set the flag of this missile to like not be returned. And when the missile goes to bounce, functionally this missile bounces like Sivir Q or Sivir W, whatever. It is said that if Draven is dead, destroy the missile when you would bounce. Like, it's very explicit to say no. This ability does not do stuff if he is dead. This was me basically commenting out all that stuff and cleaning up the bits of the logic that said make it -2. -2 for like how many bounces are left. Let's make it back to 1 bounce left, and all that stuff. And so as far as I could tell, trying every permutation of throwing it and dying I could, this seemed to work correctly. It came out from QA just fine as well. So Whirling Death will now work the same whether you're alive or dead, which is when it hits a champion, it will start turning backwards and then it will run towards his corpse. If he respawns, I believe it will go towards his new respawn. I think it's going to be very, very hard for you to throw the axes at level 6, have them go like to the enemy fountain. Like, you throw the axes at level 6, you die, they go to the enemy fountain, they hit them, they start returning to you, and then you respawn and they turn, whatever. Either way, it's a little bit of power. It's primarily QoL. This, by the way, is the kind of change that is QoL. When people say, like, hey, I want you to make, like, I don't know, my base damage is increased by 20, that would be QoL. That's not QoL. This is like something that is disproportionately, you're going to notice what's happening, but the actual impact and win rate is negligible. So for example, when we updated the mage attack frames in the previous patch, the like biggest win rate gain was like 0.6% for like substantial auto attack feels. That's QoL, right? If your change is like 0.5% win rate or less, that's probably QoL. If your change significantly buffs your champion, it no longer counts. Just FYI, it's a pet peeve. I've seen people call explicit buffs quality of life, and that's not what that term means. So just in general, it's valuable if you use terms that mean what they mean. Let's move forward. Next is a suite of buffs to Janna. We shipped some pretty big changes in the previous patch. Sadly, she is winning far fewer games than we expected. We thought this might be win rate positive, so much so that we hurried in a late nerf to Janna W. After branch cut, there's a period called stabilization where if you identify more bugs or something, you can like cleanly kind of add stuff back into the build. It requires a little more effort, but it's not as bad as micropatching. It's actually part of the core patch itself. And so we did a stabilization fix to Janna to nerf her W cooldown. Turns out she was not a big win rate threat. She actually lost, it's looking like about 2% win rate this patch. We like to give that 2% win rate back. And so we're, doing the first thing, which is of course reverting the nerf that we didn't need. It's fine, right? We are going to go ahead and buff the passive damage throughput. This is actually one thing that I overlooked. This is kind of my fault. Although I thought it was compensated for correctly, which was the old version of Janna that had this. Her passive was always gain 6% bonus move speed. However, it also her W turned off when she cast the spell, which means that Janna had both 6% bonus move speed from W and 6% bonus move speed from her passive as throughput when you cast W, but I figured, well, because you lose the W buff, which has an AP ratio and it scales past rank 1 as well, that the auto attack damage, we would gain more by not turning the W off, and so it was going to like be kind of close. And also, I just thought like these numbers were close enough, and turns out, yeah, Janna is just kind of weak in the early game. She's actually weaker in the early game than she was before. I still stand behind the Q nerfs for the most part, but if we're still not there, I might walk back one or two of them. If there's like only 1% win rate, we'll go again, try to make her better. There's also room for build improvements and whatnot. Either way, it's a 1 second cooldown buff on the W. It is a levels 1 through 10 buff to Janna passive. Technically, it's a nerf at 16 plus. No one will ever get level 16 on Janna. It doesn't matter. Her late game's really good anyway, and so I just don't care. This is technically a nerf at 16. I thought 30% was the correct number. If it should go higher, it can. I'm not against that. I just will see. And then this is a change that I should have done the first time around. I didn't know how to do it. I figured out how. Basically, Zephyr's range is now edge to edge instead of center to center. This edge to edge is how auto attacks work, and I think it's important that Zephyr works exactly like Janna's auto attack. As far as I can tell, it does. I could not find an edge case where it wasn't identical after this change, so it seems I did it correctly. This is, I think, something like a 20 range buff against Annie, which is truly negligible. You will never notice that. And it's more like a 90 range buff against like a Cho'Gath, and then like 100 something range buff if it's like a 6-stack Heartsteel Cho'Gath. Like there's a maximum number where it can be even higher. So this is a strict buff in pretty much all cases. I think maybe if you're against like Whimsy or something, it can get worse, but that's like, how are you playing Janna Lulu together? That's, you know, it's pretty fraudulent. So realistically, you're kind of always going to have range be positive here. And then just because we are searching for the right amount of win rate magnitude, I searched for things that would be simple buffs to Janna that were potentially early game skewed or at least kind of flat, and just sort of simple and sort of like lined up with like vaguely other like design goals that like are kind of nice to have. And this is like, hey, Monsoon as a situational ultimate, I don't think it needs to have a longer than average ult cooldown. Let's bring it down closer to a sort of more normal basic ult cooldown, which is more around here. I think there is definitely a lower limit on how short ulti cooldowns can get. I don't think we're there on Janna, but there's actually a reasonable argument that ults should actually have longer cooldowns than they currently do in League of Legends. Some of this might be too much ability haste in the game, you know, cooldown boots being good, for example, and like really almost omnipresent, fairly relevant. I don't know. There's a different discussion there. I don't want to get into it here. It's not that important, but let's talk about the numbers and what these changes mean for Janna. So this is assuming you're buying boots of speed level 4 and boots 2 at level 8. This is assuming you're on like cooldown boots or any other 45 move speed boot. Assuming your standard W rank up at 1, 4, 5, 7, 9, and then also a reasonable approximation of how much actual ability power Janna has, so that throughput also matters here. Of course, 20% becoming 30% is a 50% increase. 25% becoming 30% is a 20% increase. So like these you know, breakpoints 1 through 5 and 6 through 10 are unsurprising. The thing you should really care about is just the actual flat damage throughput, which is a solid amount here. It's not massive, but you know, this is on hit damage in every single W spell cast of, you know, a solid 5-ish damage throughout your mid game or like your late landing phase kind of. And I mean, this is like something. It's again not absolutely massive, but it is power positive for the first 10 levels of the game, which is a pretty large portion of the game as a support overall. The W cooldown, of course, gets to double dip this essentially, or I should say like what it multiplies itself, and so you have 5 more damage and you cast it 12% more often. You know, that is a pretty meaningful increase in W throughput. Keep in mind as well that a shorter W cooldown also gives you more E cooldowns, since E refreshes on every W cast, so meaningful there as well. So I do think this is actually a fairly delicate lever. I think this does mean quite a lot. It's more CC, it's more damage, and it's more shields, all of which certainly matter here. There is room for some build optimization, though most players go sorcery instead of going inspiration. Those sorcery players should actually be going airy more than comet. You just apply your stuff with auto attacks enough that it matters, though that said, with the W range increase, this actually might get better, and comet might be nicer, since you're going to be able to cast W from farther away. So maybe that's going to be slightly better overall. Either way, right? You know, 4 different lines of buffs to Janna. Goal here again is about 2-ish% win rate. Hopefully we hit it. That'd be nice. Janna should be in a pretty good spot next patch. Next up is Jarvan. No real numbers to talk about here. Q cooldown just being nerfed at ranks 2 through 5. It's gotten definitely way too short. Basically, now that he has some really good high haste builds, because Spear of Shojin is now a good item and he likes it a lot, he's just getting his Q onto way too short of a cooldown. Shojin is a reasonably tuned item. It has a cohort of users. It seems to be roughly appreciable in terms of what it's doing. I think those are all good things, but Jarvan is just simply doing too well, and so, you know, he's got too short of cooldowns. He's got a very, very short cooldown hard CC. Bring it back to something more normal. 6 seconds becoming 8 is, of course, a pretty substantial 1/3 increase in the cooldown. It definitely matters quite a lot. Should be a pretty heavy nerf. It won't affect his jungle clear all that much, since often your Q will come up between camps and you can't get full use out of it. But this certainly can matter if you're like, actually, I have to now wait for my second Q, and it would have already killed the wolves off or something. And certainly in any kind of DPS deck, you're casting it more than once. This can certainly impact you. I mean, this will affect your jungle clear. I mean, 0.5 seconds is going to be hard to affect you at like level 3 or 4. But I don't see this will matter. This is a real nerf. Jarvan probably a little bit sub 50, which I think is fine. But certainly a meaningful nerf to Jarvan. Next one is a pretty large update to K'Sante. This is a slew of nerfs. He is simply doing too well after the buffs from point 21. I mentioned this before in point 22's rundown and the preview of point 23, but when we measured his performance post micropatch when we were building up point 22, he seemed to be fine. We're basically pegging him to his elite win rate. Pre-update K'Sante was around like 49 in elite. We're hoping we can get K'Sante to like 50.5 in elite and rest there, since we have heavily increased the counterplay of the champion. We have like plenty of champions like Zoe and Kiana and Nidalee who are like 52%, 53% elite win rate champions and have like some ban rate, aren't in pro. They're like pretty good, but they're also beatable. And like this seems fine. People are like willing to accept this, and of course they have elite skew, and that's okay. Rek'Sai right now I think is like 51 in elite, and no one seems to have a problem with this. So we think that if K'Sante has the right amount of counterplay and the right like sort of variance in matchups where there's some good and some bad, that K'Sante can be a 51 or 50.5 elite champion. With, again, the right hallmarks of like, yeah, he's pretty good here, but we can play around it. It's going to be fine. And so the target here is essentially aggressively going after his overall laning phase, especially when he is counterpicked. This is saying, you're against Gwen. Gwen's supposed to beat you. You can't beat up Gwen in lane by spacing her. It's just not going to work. She'll sustain you. And of course she's going to beat you. You're against Jax, and Jax wins the heads-up fight against you. You can't poke him out with Q. Sorry, it's not going to be good enough. He's going to beat you in lane as well. And even if these matchups do happen where you're not allowed to space them, you also can't say, well, I'm going to wait till 6, I'm going to level 6 all in you. Just like, if we can ship down all of those things, then K'Sante actually has bad matchups instead of the bad matchups, where really, really good players know how to like space with the Q and never get engaged upon and like win anyway, and then just do like the level 6, you know, all in combo, push you into the turret, and then have enough damage to kill. It's like, nah, he's actually not going to whittle you down. You're not in kill threat even in that flip combo, and you know, we're going to go from there. So that's kind of the goal here, is like we're kind of really aggressively targeting the level 6 power spike and like the surrounding points around that to say that you really have a weakness here. K'Sante is a tank, which means you just can weak side him to some degree. He of course also is good strong side. He has crowd control, he has follow up, he has pretty good gold scaling as well. We know that he's going to be the best scaling tank, and that's fine. We know he's going to scale really well. We know he's got a lot of really good qualities, and he's going to be like high elo skewed, because knowing to play your fights correctly as a warden versus a diver versus whatever, like those are all relevant, right? Like making good choices all matter. Regardless, again, those are kind of the goals of what we're doing here, and we think we can have K'Sante in a healthier spot where he has bad matchups and you can bully him and all this. So what's changing? Well, one part of the Showmaker meme is gone. It's the mana cost. It's no longer 15. It is actually nearly doubled at low ranks. Adage I have seen many times is that, and I mean, a lot of this is true. Okay, so what am I going to say? I think, so there's two things. So one, we know pretty reliably that early games are elite skewed. I mean, elite level games literally end faster, and just people are better at snowballing, and they're more receptive to seeing what happens in the laning phase. Pro play, despite the fact that pro games actually go longer, World Finals notwithstanding, despite the fact that pro games go longer, they still care a lot about early game as well. They still care a lot about lane priority and lane matchups, because pros are also, of course, good at snowballing gold leads. So early game, we know just like scales with MMR. That's fine. The counterpoint to that I've seen, that I disagree with, though I think I'm in the minority here, is that I think early mana costs are also elite skewed. The conventional wisdom that I see is that mana costs in general are low elo skewed. If you make mana costs more punishing, bad players are bad at managing their mana, and thus will run out of mana and become useless. What I believe is true is that high-skilled players use their mana pool really, 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 really well. They are better at using abilities than low-skilled players. Now, again, eventually this is non-zero, right? If every champion has less mana, every champion has the same win rate, of course, at the end of it. And also, just in general, how am I trying to say this? If I'm playing a mage and you're playing a mage and I have more mana cost than you, of course I'm going to lose win rate, no matter like what our relative skill levels are. But I think the champions whose skill usage is more skillful, those are the ones where the mana cost matters. I think K'Sante Q is actually one of his more, I don't want to say skillful, but pro-skewed or elite-skewed elements of his kit, which is to say that, like, Pathmaker has a lot of counterplay, and really good players are actually very good at playing around Pathmaker, and is actually more of his relative power budget in lower elo. Now, to be fair, I have a friend of mine who's Masters, and he doesn't understand you should use W into, like, the Pantheon engage, so there's some problems in high elo as well. Regardless, for me flaming my friend, someone's going to watch this video and know who I'm talking about. That's going to be great. Regardless, that aside, I really, really believe usage of Q is actually elite skewed because the proper spacing of it, the proper timing of all that stuff, I think is actually there. Okay, I spent a lot of time on this. I'm sorry. Nerf the mana cost on Q, nerfing the rank up damage on Q at basically level 4, 5, 7, 9. Scaling unchanged, cooldown unchanged, all that stuff unchanged. Pathmaker, bug fix, where you could launch the dash early. Basically, if you somehow find a way to fake your dash coming out early, you will just not dash. This should be fine under regular gameplay. Nothing should happen. But technically, if the channel ends prematurely, you won't dash. If there's a way to do this in regular gameplay, send the bug. We'll look into it. We'll fix it. But this should be fine. Anyway, next change is footwork is getting technically its base increased, but its ratio has been cut by quite a lot here. This is actually a very, very, very aggressive health ratio. This is one of the most aggressive health ratios on a shield in the game, especially for its cooldown. This is like better than Nautilus W, I think, at like basically all points with a shorter cooldown, if I recall correctly. Regardless, basically the break even at rank 1 is 100 bonus health, and Doran Shield gives 110. So this is a strict nerf from levels 1 all the way through pretty much the entire game, unless you really, really can't farm well. This technically buffs K'Sante hard support. It's not good, so I don't expect this to suddenly become a good build, but technically this actually buffs K'Sante support. Whatever. The other thing is going again for his level 6 all-in. This is hitting the level 6 bonus damage on his passive very aggressively, and then by going for linear scaling, this kind of breaks even towards mid and late game, but is pretty obviously a nerf, like level 6 through 9, which is the power spec you're trying to go after the most, and then also minus 5 flat damage, 5 flat bonus AD off of the R, which says, look, again, the gold scaling is unchanged, the rank up plus 15 scaling is unchanged. This is a nerf that is most heavily felt at champion level 6. All right, let's talk about all these numbers as actual numbers. So here's K'Sante's Q cost before and after. Again, pretty meaningful cost increase. K'Sante has very, very aggressive champion mana growth, and so this kind of thing where both with the Q getting more, getting cheaper and his mana pool growing, it's kind of hard to run out of mana once you get into mid and late game, but this is going to affect his landing phase pretty severely. Here is the expected damage of the Q, accounting for his base AD and a reasonable approximation of his rune page and a 4-item build by level 18. So you can see it is still, of course, a meaningful damage nerf, even when you do have gold income and champion levels for the AD. This does not count the R, giving you more AD, which will flatten out a little bit. This is a, percentage-wise, smaller nerf to RQ. But of course, still a meaningful damage nerf to, a solid part of his kit. So again, and felt pretty early on, right? So landing phase, early all-in nerf, most aggressively the nerf at level 9, then it, slowly wanes as time goes on. Again, caring about your scaling a bit more. Here is the power of the E shield before and after. Of course, we're assuming no grass stacks right now, but as you, buy items, you get grass stacks, get overgrowth stacks. This starts to get worse and worse and worse and worse until you finally get to champion level 14, where you get the big rank up incentive and the shield comes back. For reference, this is, I believe, 1800 bonus health is the number I plugged in here for level 18. This is reasonably accurate when you consider things like overgrowth and grass stacks. It's around there for a 4-item build, plus runes, but it's just in that ballpark here. Again, overall a nerf, don't get me wrong, but primarily felt, right, you can see in this sort of mid-game area where he can't just shield away trades nearly as aggressively, though it still has a pretty solid gold scaling, and you can see you're, more than doubling the damage of the shielded ability at like one item and change. And then here is the data table of passive total damage during the ultimate. So instead of doing 145% damage, 130% of the damage, this is still true damage. So it's not only is it doing bonus damage, but it's also penetrating their armor. But you can see, right, again, a nerf until champion level 10, then a nerf again. And then you can see sort of by the end game, it's about as much green as red here. This is, relatively the same from 13 plus, but obviously pretty aggressively a nerf 6 through 12 on average. Yeah, it's, again, an early game skewed nerf. One thing that we did see happen with this update overall, because W became such a better spell in the early game that was actually good as a parry and did enough damage to matter, that we actually really aggressively buffed Cassante's early game with the overall changes from 13.20. And so trying to walk back some of that early game strength we gave him by saying, no, you really should be weaker until one or more full items. This should be, a better shape for you as a champion, that you should actually care about the scaling and not be very quickly a bully, even in your bad matchups. Next change is one to Nafiri. I want to talk about sort of overall goals of the champion, right? Being relatively easy to play assassin. This is true. A lot of Nafiri's champion mastery is gained by the 10 through 15th game, and it starts to slow down pretty aggressively. That's a pretty moderate skill curve. A champion like Riven or Zed is more of a straight line where you can gain some mastery 10 to 15. Like Nafiri actually gains more win rate, gains games 1 through 10 than Zed does 1 through 10, but then 10 through 20 Nafiri is much less gain than Zed's 10 through 20. And eventually you'd have chances fly off into the sunset and keep, requiring mastery over time. But Nafiri has a pretty sharp early learning curve and then actually flattens out pretty quickly. That's totally expected and kind of intended. Not a lot of pressure to end games. Nafiri actually has pretty good late game overall. And yeah, just is meant to be a good assassin in lower skilled games. That is meant to be the case here, which means Nafiri needs to have and should have an above 50% win rate in lower skilled lobbies. This should be the case. This is an explicit goal that she should be good somewhere, and she's going to be good in lower skilled lobbies as an assassin. Okay, fine. Right now, though, Nafiri's measured performance is that she is I think, on the high side of acceptable for lower skilled lobbies, but the fact that she's above 50% in elite skilled games as well makes me think that Nafiri is simply too good if she's meant to be low elo skewed, but also a winning champion in elite MMRs. Makes me think Nafiri is a little bit too powerful. She has a pretty high sustained ban rate as well. That ban rate decay has slowed down pretty aggressively, so it's okay, players are banning her. She's winning quite a lot of games. She can use a tap down. We're not trying to go too hard here. Again, if we do more than 1.5%, we will happily bring Nafiri back up because she, again, really deserves to be very good somewhere. Ideally, any champion is very good somewhere. That would be the ideal, where every champion's got somewhere they can shine, either in games where you're snowballing, you're crushing, or just generically in an MR band, you're very, very good. It's good to have every champion have some kind of home where it's here's somewhere they always are going to feel good, and that's kind of the case. So we're generally going for level scaling nerfs. Well, I should say really not so much level scaling nerfs, but relatively flat nerfs that aren't going after gold scaling of the champion. Also, I try to pick targets that I thought would be anti-melee skewed, since some of what has kept us afraid with Nafiri as well is how strong she has been in top lane. And though she's not ultra popular in top, she's more common in mid lane. I'm uneasy with Nafiri being an equally powerful top laner as mid. We've had to make very specific nerfs to her before, and I would like to give us the breathing room to make whatever change we want without being afraid of Nafiri top taking over. If we do want to buff Nafiri back, it would be nice if there's actually a win rate delta here, so that we can comfortably take the buff that we think makes her the most fun without being worried about top Nafiri being 54% win rate, which I think is just too good for any given champion in almost any case here. So it is flat damage nerfs, and it's meant to be relatively flat with game time, right? This is why the level 1 damage is down, as well as the level scaling is down on the passive, and the level 1 damage is down as well as the level scaling damage is down on the E. Try to do that relatively equally here, and so here is the data table on Nafiri passive. You can see it's actually a little bit more in the early game than late game, and via the Q it's very, very close here. It's basically always down about 4% damage. There's obviously weird movements around because hey, at level 7 you haven't ranked it past level 1, and the AD ratio kicks in, and then at level 13 it's actually a power trough where you get the most nerf, and then it comes back with gold scaling coming in. I mean, you can get rid of the decimal point, and it's just relatively similar numbers at all points in time. But hey, it's 5 damage off of E if you land both halves of E. Sorry, 5%. And it's about 15 or 13% of the damage off the passive overall. This is accounting for the AD ratio as well. To be clear, the AD ratio is actually pretty meager here. You never quite double the damage, whereas you get closer to doing that with the E overall. Regardless, this is all to say that it's a small tap down to Nafiri. Neither the passive nor the E are the majority of her damage, but just meant to be a tap down because I think she's performing a little bit too well, but should still perform very well, especially in lower elo games. Next is a buff to Riven. Riven definitely directly lost win rate in 13.20. She measurably lost win rate, and this win rate decay remained. And yeah, she's pretty snowballing reliant is kind of the theory here. And so basically trying to give her kind of back some of the snowballing because she lost it structurally. We can give it back to her as a champion. Riven being a snowbally top laner is fine. In general, I think they're a little bit weirdly isn't quite enough snowballing in top in mid on average. And so if we can give a champion some back in a way where we're buffing them because they deserve to be buffed, I think it's reasonable to try to, again, kind of close the gap in terms of snowballiness and like gank fertileness, right? Like the value of you ganking for top and mid, it'd be valuable to raise that a little bit because as elo goes up, people tend to gank bot lane more, and I would like for this to be a little more equitable overall. So anyway, it is a gold scaling buff on Q and is a gold scaling buff on R. Let's talk about the numbers here. Riven is actually accounting for her normal build, which is like, I think it's a Doran's blade start more than a longsword start, and then it's kind of interpolating her gold income through time. There's actually an early game buff more than not. Keep in mind that a 5% total AD ratio gain means that the lion's share of the damage is actually in the AD ratio, not the flat base damage. You can see here, right, 15. Now it's actually in the 50s here. So the single biggest buff percentage-wise is actually in the 1 through 3. And so Riven might have significantly nicer early trading patterns. This might mean 1 or 2 of her matchups flip in the 1, 2, 3 area, and she has enough damage. Keep in mind, she casts a spell 3 times, so this is 15 damage in her given all in. This is not huge, don't get me wrong, but this is still a meaningful amount of her damage going up, and maybe it flips one of her matchups. Maybe it doesn't, but directionally it helps her early game. Riven's early game right now is actually quite weak. She doesn't tend to win most of her early game matchups, despite the fact that she has to be in melee range to play them. I think Riven is kind of balanced on a knife's edge in this regard, because if you are the losing side against Riven, she has a lot of gap close and a lot of damage, and if you're the losing side as Riven, you can't last hit without being in threat range. So it's tough, but I think Riven's early game is slightly too weak. If we need to nerf her late game in some other way down the line, we can do that. But for now, giving her more of a fighting chance in her laning matchup seems more than reasonable. Still some gold scaling up overall seems reasonable. This is a data table of roughly how much total attack damage Riven would have during R if we extrapolate her builds. This can, of course, feed back into the Q damage there as well, since you have a 5% AD ratio increase and you get some more damage during R to feed back into the damage of Q, which, yeah, it's a meaningful increase to the power spike of Riven fighting during her ultimate. I'm a big fan of ults being strong power spikes, so I think this does this here. Trundle is getting some very simple changes. Basically, Trundle in the top lane kind of sucks. It has generically been his most popular role, or his more popular role compared to jungle, though he is a pretty bad top laner and a pretty mediocre jungler right now. And so we're trying to give him buffs that will disproportionately help top lane. And because his win rate skew can handle it, we would like to normal skew this as well. So generically, attack damage growth is top lane skewed. Top laners gain more XP than any other role in the game. It is low elo skewed, because low elo games go longer and thus champions gain more XP. And so just more of the games are played at level 16, 17, 18. And of course, a mana cost change on Q is basically irrelevant in the jungle, but certainly matters in top lane, recasting this very constantly for last hits or trading patterns. So we think these are going to be very clearly top lane skewed. This will, of course, affect his jungle some. But is of course very top lane skewed and somewhat low elo skewed. For a marksman, this would be something like 2% win rate of pure AD growth. I don't think it's going to be that far off for Trundle himself, but we'll see. Either way, here's the data table on Trundle damage. Here is his base AD before and after. It is a very meaningful increase. Now keep in mind, a lot of fighter items care about your base AD explicitly. This would be something like an Iron Spike Whip if you went for Stridebreaker or Gorgebreaker, not that you should. This is very explicitly the Sheen damage of Trinity Force, as well as the Threefold Strikes bonus AD of Trinity Force. This is the bonus AD granted to you by Sterix Gauge. This is if you went for a Dead Man's Plate cares about your base AD, I believe. Even if it cares about your total AD, that still factors in. If you go for a Ravenous Hydra is your total AD, so at least it still has an impact, even if it's not just bonus. So it's something here, right? This definitely matters, not only in just his auto attack DPS, but also in his synergy with these items. This is, by the way, the expected rough total AD for Trundle, accounting for runes, accounting for items, and accounting that his Q is on him at all points in time as well. At level 6, I power spiked and said Trinity Force has been purchased, so we're going to roll in the threefold strikes bonus AD here as well. And so in actual practice, Trundle has, 3 to 5% more total AD, which means, hey, his total attack damage when hitting you is going to be significantly higher. The vast majority of his damage, of course, is in his Q itself, which means, in his auto attack itself, which means this is basically just a DPS increase. Trundle is gaining, 2 to 5% more damage, just damage as a champion, which is a 1 to 2.5% win rate gain, which is, about what we expect to see here, right? So that plus the Chomp mana cost increase should be a pretty solid buff to Trundle in the top lane. Should feel a lot better, should be in a much closer to balanced spot. I don't think it'll be significantly over 50, but regardless, a pretty good buff all the same. Vel'Koz is getting a relatively light buff overall to his passive. In terms of just raw power, Vel'Koz is performing okay. He's about 80% win rate. There could totally be changes that make him feel better to play, but in terms of raw power, Vel'Koz is mostly fine. This is kind of a light touch here. The explicit goal here is that we don't, as I mentioned earlier, we don't have a ton of QA or engineering resources, and so we're basically just going for very light changes for most of the rest of the year, unless we can scrounge up QA from like another team or something. But regardless, it is a light touch to a part of Vel'Koz's kit that requires him to be sort of more skillful, right? It's you have to land 3 button presses here on your opponent. So it's a base damage increase and an AP ratio increase to the amount of tree damage coming out of the passive. So let's talk about the numbers here overall. Vel'Koz passive for a support or mid laner is doing about 10 to 15% more damage at all points in time. For the support build, this is basically just taking his most common 4-item build on support, and for mid, this is taking his most common 4-item build on mid. Supports finish death cap in 5% of all games. Mid laners finish it in 25% of all games. So I kind of split the difference and said that, Vel'Koz is gaining. I said that, look, if you are going to get to a 4-item build, right, a post-level 16 build, we're going to include death cap here as you're getting like 500 or so bonus ability power. In the support case, you tend to not be, and so his most common build doesn't include death cap. So it's a substantial AP increase for mid compared to support. I think that's more than reasonable for how the income actually works and the types of items actually built for the various classes. Roughly gold per level is around this. Keep in mind as well that, like, of course, Vel'Koz mid gains more XP than Vel'Koz support. He also has more ability power than Vel'Koz support at most points in time. So, any buff that is level-based and gold-based will, on average, tend to affect Vel'Koz mid more than support. I mean, we'll see. Like, per XP gained, it's still going to be relatively similar. It's just like, Vel'Koz support experiences this, this 10 through 12%, and Vel'Koz mid experiences the 11 through 15%. These are relatively similar, to be honest, so I don't expect substantial skew here. I think it's going to be very slightly mid-skew, but I could be wrong, of course, about that. This is a comparison of this number to this number at any point in time, and so it's like, maybe 1% more buff per buff to mid than support, but again, pretty light overall. This isn't going to be a huge change. Ziggs did not lose almost anything from the armor nerf from the previous patch. He lost very, 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 very little, and so ultimately, we're nerfing him in a more obvious way by nerfing the flat damage on his Q. Now that Q is more reliable, it can do less damage. Pretty easy stuff here. The more ability power, the more XP you have, the less 10 flat damage matters. So this nerf should hopefully be a little bit bot lane skewed. We'll see. This 1 AD came courtesy of Arena. We kept it. It's fine. Doesn't really matter. It doesn't do very much to him. Who cares? And then the other change is a cooldown and mana cost nerf to Satchel Charge. My experience, both playing as, with, and against Ziggs is that Ziggs gets to spam W a lot more in bot lane as an aggressive tool because he's just safe a lot of the time. He we have push. Okay, I'm going to spam W for poke, and my support's going to poke you, and it's just going to be free, and I'm not going to get engaged on because I'm not afraid of you. Whereas in mid, you have to much more reliably save this as self-peel or for a gank tool or whatever. So I believe pretty strongly Satchel Charge is bot lane skewed. I could be wrong, of course, but nerfing both the mana cost and the cooldown because this is the ability that I think a lot of the times bot Ziggs is just allowed to spam at you, and it's very reliably landing. So data table, here's Q damage before and after, accounting for a relatively normal build. Damage, again, difference falls off at level 9 and as you gain more gold. And then the W cooldown before and after, again, nerfed very strongly until champion level 18, which, yeah, if a nerf softens by gaining levels, a mid laner is going to gain the levels before a bot laner is going to gain the levels, and so this nerf arguably means less for a mid laner as a result. That does it for champion changes. We go on to systemic changes. We have some gold on turrets adjustments. I made these changes as a way to try to inject a little bit more agency toward top laners. I didn't generally raise the value of turrets themselves very much. I just simply raised the selfish value of these turrets. Statistically, top laners kill the most turrets and earn the most turret gold of any role in the game at every MR bracket. And so I said, hey, well, if the gold from turrets is shifted toward local gold to a top laner, that should help a top laner feel more empowered and be stronger overall. We did not change outer turrets because I was worried about optimizations where you wouldn't finish the turret and you'd go run your AD carry over and funnel them gold. That became an optimal strategy. I don't want that to happen with tier 2 and especially inhibitor turrets. That's so unlikely to happen. It's just too risky that we got to go kind of hard here. So tier 2 turrets simply have 125 gold shifted into local gold away from global gold. The total gold value is unchanged. For inhibitor turrets, we actually raised the overall value of the turret itself by 200, but shifted 125 from global into local, and then added another bit on top as well to say that if you want to risk going for an inhibitor turret yourself, you're more than welcome to go for it. Again, if your entire team is sieging the tier 2, the total value is unchanged. If your entire team is sieging the inhibitor turret, I guess that's, 40 more gold a piece. Not a huge deal, but it does something, of course. And I went and did a pass on tooltips because they are kind of out of date here. Nothing too spicy to talk about, but hey, tooltips are, nice to update when you want to look at them. Your turrets, by the way, have tooltips. They have items. You can read them. They explain what some of the rules around how the turrets work overall. That's basically the rundown. That's what we're doing in the patch. I guess we could do a TLDR real quick. Hopefully this goes pretty quickly. Let's talk about it. Azir W now worked with on hit effects, including spicier ones like Rage Blade, Renan's Hurricane, and Kraken Slayer. Lichbane, I think, is the scary one here. We'll see. We can tune this damage lever whenever needed, and there is a compensation nerf to W because you're now applying Dasher's Tooth on your primary target on W. We'll see what happens with Winter Magnitude. We'll try to keep Azir's one at the same. If this means a different change in 0.24, of course we can. Briar loses 20 base health and some execute damage, which are meant to disproportionately nerf lethality Briar. That's the goal here. We'll see if it happens. Draven gets some QoL. His R now returns while he's dead. Janna gets some pretty substantial buffs, levels 1 through 10, more damage on Tailwind. Every rank of Zephyr has a shorter cooldown. Every rank of Zephyr has a farther cast range, and Monsoon has 20 seconds off his cooldown at all ranks. Definitely meaningful buffs to Janna. Jarvan loses 0 to 2 seconds on his Q cooldown based on rank. He's doing too well overall. Kasana gets some pretty aggressive laning phase and early all-in power nerfs, so mana cost nerf that you won't really feel much at level 9, but you really will feel 1 through 8. A small damage nerf that you're going to feel from levels 4 through 9, I should say, that should be relatively meaningful. And it makes more of his damage care about his passive, which means he has to be in threat range, and more of his damage care about his W, which has counterplay, and so we're just kind of get rid of some of his poke power here overall. Overall, less resilient to bad matchups. The E shield is being weakened at basically all points in time. Just with the Doran shield, it's a strict nerf at rank 1. And of course, as you get more health, it's a nerf and nerf and nerf and nerf. And you probably don't make it all the way up back at rank 5. Meanwhile, a level 6 nerf to all out by around level 13 plus. It's relatively power neutral, but 6 through 12, generally going to be mostly power negative here on the all out damage, as well as minus 5 AD from all out as well, which is going to be, focused as a level 6 power spike down for the rest of it compared to the rest of it. If you're getting a relatively flat across game time base damage nerf on both the passive and the total damage on E, this is around, I think, 15% off, and this is around 5% damage off overall in sort of some total result of what happens to the champion. It's meant to be a relatively small, roughly 1% winner nerf to Nafiri. If we overshoot by too much, we will happily walk some of this back. The goal is not to overnerf Nafiri, but just bring it down about 1%. Riven gets some extra gold scaling on both her Q and her R. This actually specifically buffs her early game more than everything else. Level 1 is actually the most impacted relative damage change of any point in time on Riven here. Riven gets a massive +1 AD growth and some lighter mana costs on Q. This is going to be top lane skewed and make him even better with Sheen items like Trinity Force, as well as other fighter items like Sterix Gauge. Vel'Koz gets a pretty moderate, roughly this ends up being about 10% more damage on the passive to Vel'Koz. Ziggs gets minus 10 flat damage on his Q, a longer cooldown, and higher mana cost on W overall, which I expect to be bot lane skewed. This one here as well, but overall need to take some power out of Ziggs. Turret gold adjustment. Inner turrets have 125 gold shifted from global into local gold, and inhibitor turrets have not only 125 shifted from global into local, but also extra local gold earned in the first place, so that there is a total of a 200 gold value increase to the inhibitor turret itself. Some tools updates, also fun stuff as well. Thanks for watching. See you next time. Bye-bye.